Can Bashar Assad say that he won? Because if winning means having 500,000 dead and half of the country that fled their homes and hundreds of thousands of houses destroyed, then who would be called defeated? Maybe what he means by winning was the masterful game of allying with Iran and Russia. But was it all intended to protect the life and security of his people, or to not resign from power? You judge. Who won and who lost in a battle in one of the most geostrategic territories in the world? This is the conflict in Syria, which caused the largest refugee crisis after the Second World War.
The unrest in Syria grew out of discontent with the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad in 2011 and escalated to an armed conflict after protests calling for Assad's removal were violently suppressed. The war is being fought by several factions. The Syrian government's armed forces, a loose alliance of majorly Sunni opposition rebel groups, Salafi jihadist groups, the mixed Kurdish Arab Syrian Democratic Forces, Daesh, and a number of countries in the region and beyond being either directly involved or providing support to one or another faction. In 2012, the situation got even worse. Daesh, taking advantage of chaos, started occupying Syrian territory very quickly and in 2014 almost took the control of most of Syria. In this situation, Russia, Iran, and US coalition intensified its attacks against the terrorist group, which led to the weakening of Daesh in Syria. The way that in 2018, the Syrian president announced the end of Daesh in his country.
They have long known that there is no military solution, only a political solution.
Parallel to the battle have been celebrated different rounds of dialogue between the representatives of government and opposition with international mediators like United Nations, United States, Iran, Russia, and Turkey, but none has a result till now. The Syrian crisis has left more than 400,000 estimated deaths and over half the population driven from their homes in what is the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Even though all the conflict apparently was to overthrowing Bashar al-Assad, he still is in power and doesn't seem to step down.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Mystery and Politics. Today we have Mr. Mohammad Ali through Skype. He is PressTV correspondent in Damascus, Syria. And inside the studio we have Aziz Hamid, who is a political commentator from Syria. Mr. Mohammad Ali, thanks for joining us. Please tell me, who is the responsible for Syrian war?
Well, first of all, in my opinion, this is a proxy war. It was planned by various states against Syria, and the terrorists themselves were just the tools in the hands of those countries, like the United States, many Western countries, and many regional countries over here. Some media outlets tried to portray the events as if it was a civil war. But in fact, when we look at the facts that there were terrorists coming from over 90 states to fight inside Syria, when we look at the tons of weapons that were smuggled into the country, and up till now the Syrian army is confiscating many, it's clear to see now that this was a war waged by those Western states that are supporting those terrorists on the ground. At first, the Syrian government, the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, even changed the constitution, amended many laws, but at the end of the day, it wasn't about reforms. The Syrian president made it clear since 2011 and said that this is a war waged on Syria by foreign states using terrorists as a tool.
Aziz Hamid, as you heard, Mr. Mohammad Ali says that all what happened in Syria was a proxy war and a foreign complot to overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I sort of agree with him, except he didn't mention the internal reasons for the revolution. As we all know, the Syrian revolution is the most complex revolution in the Middle East. It's different than other revolutions. Unlike the Tunisian, Libyan, and Egyptian revolutions, they ended quite fast in comparison to the Syrian revolution. And I think the Syrian revolution happened mainly because of internal reasons and external reasons. The first internal reason is oppression that Al-Assad government had in Syria for 4 decades, starting from his father Hafiz al-Assad, followed by his son. And the second internal reason is injustice and severe injustice in distribution of power and resources in Syria. They distributed everything mainly only in the 12% of the Al-Whites minority. And the external reasons are, I agree with Mr. Mohammad Ali on this, is that some external countries like Israel and the States, they are trying to increase the instability in the Middle East and spark war and revolutions to be able to expand the state of Israel and announce a new worldwide order.
Okay, and talking about overthrowing Bashar al-Assad, some people believe Assad is a dictator and some other oppose that. You, Mr. Mohammad Ali, that are living in Syria, how do you see the opinion of Syrian people in this context?
Well, at the end of the day, President Bashar al-Assad was elected legitimately by the Syrian people. And if we look at what happened, the Syrians voted over here back during the years of war for President Bashar al-Assad for presidency. And he is now legitimately president of the Syrian Arab Republic. While states that call the Syrian president a dictator are the same states that are supporting terrorists on the ground over here to topple the Syrian government. So their opinion is not very important for the Syrians themselves, who have been fighting inside Syria against terrorists for their independence, for the independence of their decision.
Aziz Hamid, do you agree with Muhammad Ali? He says that Assad is a legitimate president.
I personally don't support Al-Assad in lots of his actions and lots of his strategies.
Why?
I see that he didn't act in the right way to control the situation and to regain the stability in his country. However, that doesn't allow me to say he isn't the legitimate president. He is a legitimate president and his government is a legitimate government. And all other governments in the world, they acknowledge him and address them as a legitimate government. So I cannot deny that,
Yeah. Let me move on. Foreign intervention in Syria. Mr. Mohammad Ali, as you know, Syrian government in many occasions have condemned the foreign troops' presence in its territory. But on the other hand, we see many other troops from Iran and Russia there. How do you see that?
Foreign troops that are inside Syria, like US troops, Turkish troops, and others like French troops, they all came without the invitation or consent or even a mandate from the Syrian from the United Nations. While at the other hand, on the other side, the Russian troops, the Iranian military advisors are inside Syria operating at the invitation and request of the Syrian government. And this makes their presence a legitimate one according to international law. But the US troops and all of other foreign troops that came without the invitation of the Syrian government are definitely over here illegally, and their presence and their acts and actions inside Syria are against international law and even against the UN Charter and Syria's sovereignty.
How do you see this issue? I mean, the foreign intervention in Syria.
That's a really good question. And to address this question in the right way, in a logical way, we have to first have a look at the most up-to-date military dominance map. If we look at the dominance map in Syria, we will find that Syria basically is controlled by 3 sides. The first side is the Assad government, and they control 60% of Syria, the central territory, till the western border of Syria. And Al-Assad government is supported by by Russian forces and Iranian forces, the majority being from the Iranian forces. The second side is the resistance or the Free Syrian Army. They exist in the northern part of Syria, in Idlib, and they exist in the southern part. In the north part, they are supported by 3 military bases for Turkey, and in the southern part, they have 1 large, strong military base for the US. And the third side on this map is what they call the Free Syrian
Army.
Yeah, the Free Syrian Army, which is basically the Quds.
Yeah.
It expands from the western border of Syria, the Iraqi-Syrian border, and they control 27% approximately of the Syrian land. They are supported by mainly the United States. They have 6 large bases for the United States there. So, yeah, Syria is of significant importance to multiple forces in the world and lots of countries.
Okay. Mr. Mohammad Ali, you have been working in Syria as a correspondent in the last 8 years, and you were reporting the ongoing situation in that country. Can you tell me about Daesh, known as also as ISIS? Who are the main supporter of this group in the region?
Well, we've seen many times, and we've heard a lot of reports during the years of war here, that there are many companies in the private sector in the Persian Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar providing financial support to Daesh, which is also known as ISIL, of course. Also, we've seen a lot of times that the US itself, when it was dropping by its and the aircrafts weapons for the so-called moderate opposition groups, those weapons at the end of the day are always ending up in the hands of Daesh, also known as ISIL. Also, the so-called US-led coalition, it was formed in 2014 under the pretext of fighting terrorism, mainly Daesh. But since that time, the US did not actually eliminate Daesh, whether in Syria or Iraq. It always worked on portraying to the world that it is fighting Daesh, but eventually and at the end of the day, Daesh remained operating inside Syria. And also, if we look at some US-led coalition strikes, many of them were actually in support of Daesh on the ground. For example, when the US-led coalition attacked the Deir el-Zor countryside, particularly Al-Tarde mountains, it directly attacked Syrian army troops on top of those hills of Al-Tarde. And after just 30 minutes of this attack on the Syrian troops, Daesh on the ground carried out an offensive on those same areas and took control of those hilltops, strategic hilltops they were at that time. And if we look at what happened in general, we can see that Daesh was able only to control more land there because of the US-led coalition strikes. There are many examples that the US has supported Daesh in many ways throughout the unrest here in Syria.
Aziz, Hamid, Muhammad Ali is saying that Saudi Arabia and US coalition are the main sponsors of Daesh in Middle East. Do you agree with that? Or can you tell me how Daesh was created?
How Daesh was created? That's a good question. Daesh, as known as ISIS or the Islamic State, I believe that they are supported by anti-Islamic countries, the countries that fight Islam basically, even though it's called Islamic State. However, Daesh, I believe, was supported and originated by Israel and the United States, could be funded by some rich Gulf state countries like Saudi, Emirates and Saudi, yeah. Daesh mainly entered Syria through the western border of Syria, the Iraqi-Syrian border. And as I have mentioned before, this border is controlled by the Kurds and they are supported by 6 military bases for the US. So how did Daesh went through this area without having any conflict or war with the US? That raised some questions.
Yeah, and the final question is, have you seen, Mr. Muhammad Ali, the perspective of the situation in Syria?
Well, the situation inside Syria is much more better than before. Now the Syrian government is in control of most of the country. Almost all of the major cities are secured thanks to the Syrian army and its allies in fighting terrorism. Regarding President Bashar al-Assad in the upcoming presidential elections, if the Syrian people vote for President Bashar al-Assad, definitely he will be the president, because at the end of the day, the entire war was fought by the Syrian people and the Syrian army for the independence of their decision and for not having any kind of foreign intervention inside their country or their decisions or opinions.
Aziz Hamid, how do you see the future of Syria? Will Assad continue in power?
Al-Assad will continue for some time, but eventually he'll fall. It's just a matter of when and how will he fall.
But shouldn't be in a short term, because he didn't give up for 8 years.
Yeah. I believe the centralized forces in Syria are trying to prolong the war as much as possible. I believe they are trying to prepare themselves for the war. I believe Assad will fall eventually, and maybe the spark of World War III will happen there, because we have Turkey, we have the US, we have Russia, we have Iran, we have Syria, and we have also Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we have China ready to attack and take part in the war. So it will happen. It's just a matter of time. And as we have seen before, the first Arab Spring in 1914 started the First World War. And the Second World War was just finishing the unfinished business of the First World War, and that's the Second Arab Spring. So I believe it will end eventually with the Third World War.
The Third World War?
Yep.
Between who?
Between United States, Russia, Iran, the Middle East.
Over Syria?
Yeah, it will happen in Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, the Sham in general, not over Syria. They will just, everything will be chaotic. Chaos will be controlling everything. Everyone will be fighting everyone.
Bashar al-Assad says that he didn't step down because of his people and defending the country. But I say, at what cost? Having 500,000 dead is protecting the country and the people, or is just the issue of sticking to the power? You judge.